I'm delighted to introduce our panel of speakers this evening. It will start off appropriately enough with Didi Herman, whose hugely important and path-breaking book, An Unfortunate Coincidence, Jews, Jewishness and English Law, was published by Oxford University Press earlier this year. After Didi has spoken briefly, trying to set out what she was trying to achieve and address in the book, she'll be followed by David Seymour, who is a director of research in the School of Law at Lancaster University, and who has written widely on themes such as anti-Semitism, law, and the Holocaust. And after David, we'll hear from Professor Malaya Malik, who's Professor of Law at King's College, London, and who has written, again, widely on anti-discrimination and the law, and on multiculturalism, among other themes. So I will belt up now and hand over to Didi.
Thank you very much, David. Right. I'd like to thank David for organising this roundtable and the Pears Institute and the staff at the Pears Institute. Already, I think, although it's quite a new venture, I've been really impressed with the work that David and the Institute have been doing, so I'm very pleased to just be a part of that. And I'd also like to thank this David and Malaya for agreed to do this. It's very generous of them both. So I'm really going to just say a few words by way of introduction to the book and to the approach that I took to the material that I looked at in it. Just by way of background, I've always been interested in dynamics of race and in racial thinking, but also in considering racialized understandings, including but beyond skin color. So, for example, how whiteness itself is historically and culturally contingent, how religious understandings blend into racialized ones, how legacies of racial thinking continue to be significant in terms of how we understand and analyze law and legal decision-making. This interest took on a particular complexion after I moved to England from Toronto over 21 years ago now. I was struck by how different it seemed to be Jewish here, and how odd, to me, the English were about Jewishness. I was struck by both what I perceived to be an element of Anglican English distaste for things perceived to be Jewish, and this was different to the sort of anti-Semitism I was familiar with in Canada. But I was also intrigued by particular forms Jewish assimilation had taken in England. And I was interested in what seemed to be the somewhat oxymoronic idea of the English Jew. I understand now more than I did then some of the cultural and historical reasons why Jewishness takes on the particular meanings it does here, including very important work by our host, David Feldman. In terms of my own discipline, I was also struck by how undeveloped the field of critical race legal studies was here compared to North America, where there was a large body of scholarship, albeit almost nothing on Jews and Jewishness, on how ideas about race infused judicial discourse, although Malaya's work is a notable exception to that. So I guess I wrote this book because I wanted to explore some of this further in the English context. The aims of the project, I would say, were to challenge dominant perceptions about English law, such as, for example, that the courts are secular arbiters. I wanted to show their Christian past and present, and look more closely at the work the idea of secularity does in legal judgments. Or that judicial racial thinking about Jewishness was a thing of the past, I wanted to show that while certain discourses may get altered or replaced by others, English courts remain deeply indebted to Christian supersessionary thought. In other words, that Christianity equals progress. And that this past and present of judicial Christian thinking about Jews and Jewishness might have some resonance for current debates about Islam and Muslimness and other minorities. And that considering racialized and Orientalist judicial thinking makes for a richer, more complex understanding of English law. And that this understanding demonstrates that law is not some kind of autonomous field, but is deeply embedded in wider frameworks of racial categorization and hierarchy. That judges are active agents making choices. In the introduction to the book, I explain some of the choices I made around methodology, how I came to look at the cases that I did, why I didn't look at others, why I chose the time frame I did, and so on. I'm not going to go over that here. I found the concepts of racialization and Orientalism helpful in terms of developing analysis of the cases that I looked at. And I use racialization in the book to mean literally engaging in measurements that draw conclusions about people based on their perceived racial blood. And I use Orientalism to signify a civilizational discourse positing Western Christianity at the apex of world civilizations. And so from this I made several arguments, and the main arguments of the book are that English judges draw on and contribute to racialized and Orientalized processes in finding their way in and through Jews and Jewishness. So, for example, I explore a set of cases over the course of the 20th century where Jewish litigants were seen by judges to be alien, to exhibit behaviors that were not appropriately English, and to be themselves responsible for their own misfortunes. 2, that both racialization and Orientalism have a theological component. There is Christian thinking going on here, especially in terms of what is understood to be universal as opposed to particular, and what is understood to be progress as opposed to primitive. And I consider this in different contexts, such as disputes between parents as to how children should be brought up, or the JFS case, where the matrilineal test was considered by the Supreme Court to be contrary to the principles of English equality law. 3, I was also interested in the concept of conversion. How can we see what is going on in these cases as being about conversion to Christianity? In the book, I consider this idea in several contexts, including trust law and child welfare law. 4, that these processes of racialization and Orientalism tell us as much about England and Englishness as they do about the more explicit subjects of judicial discourse. David asked me to say a little bit about the significance of the book, both in terms of studies of law and in terms of studies of anti-Semitism. I'm afraid that explaining the significance of my own work is not a strong point of mine. I can only talk about it in terms of what I hope the book contributes. And this is as an example of how critical work on race, religion, and ethnicity in judicial discourse could be done. In other words, I hope it has some merit as a contribution to a field that remains embryonic in the UK. Even if it's seen to be unsuccessful, I hope it opens up more conversation. Similarly, I hope it makes some contribution to the field of Jewish studies, if only providing material that has not yet been considered in that field. And I would also hope that it helps to bring the field of Jewish studies to the attention of legal scholars. At a more conceptual, theoretical, or analytic level, I hope the book makes a contribution to several fields, including legal scholarship, Jewish studies, and other disciplinary studies of race, religion, and ethnicity. And I'll just mention 2 specific aspirations here. First, by shining more light on the significance of Christian thinking and giving an account of how Christian thinking might be linked to ideas about racialization and Orientalism in judicial discourse. And I'd also like to think the book makes a contribution in terms of thinking about the relationship between Englishness and law, and behavior in and around the law, how our understandings about legal propriety are shaped by ones about Anglican Englishness. It's easier for me to talk about dilemmas rather than significances, so I'll end with a couple of those. There are many challenges I faced as I worked on the book, including the varied reactions of readers and listeners, but I'd just like to end by reflecting on two of these. The first is to do with the role of the concept of anti-Semitism. This was one of the most difficult choices I made early on, whether to use this concept in my analysis of the cases, and if so, how. In the end, I was persuaded by the arguments of Jewish studies scholars, Brian Chayette and David Feldman amongst them, who argued that the term may obscure more than it illuminates, and that it needs to be used very carefully. I felt the arguments of the book would communicate themselves better to readers if I avoided the term, for the most part. But there's a cost to this choice that continues to disturb me. It seems harder and harder to name racism as racism, particularly in the academy. It's too simplistic or too modern or too meta-narrative or too unnuanced. And at some level, these criticisms are persuasive, but I remain concerned about what we are losing, politically even if not intellectually, in the process. The second reflection is to do with my initial interest in keeping at the forefront the people that these cases were about. I did not want the book to be all about the judges, but also about the people who were the subjects of the cases. This issue has bothered me since law school, about 25 years ago, where I found myself deeply uncomfortable with how we study law. I did initially try to follow through on this, but I found it increasingly difficult to go in that direction and maintain scholarly form. I felt increasingly constrained by the form our work is meant to take. So I feel I've largely failed in that endeavor, and I'm trying again in a current project. Finally, coming back to where I started, I have wondered whether only an outsider could have attempted this book, i.e. someone not from this country, and if so, what that might mean. But perhaps that's something we can take up in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank David and Didi for asking me. So thank you very much. And listening to those comments, if this book is a failure, then I hope to fail as well at some time in my future. If people are okay with this, I'm more or less going to read, but hopefully in a way that is audible. Let me begin my comments on Didi's new work, An Unfortunate Coincidence, Jews, Jewishness and English Law, with an anecdote of a fortunate coincidence. I first met Didi some years ago when, by chance, we were sitting next to each other at the official welcoming of doctoral students at Warwick University. Indeed, I recall almost verbatim the conversation concerning, as it did, how it came to pass that we were both there, and more especially why someone would leave Toronto for Coventry. In fact, and as a consequence of my own relationship with what I have often thought of as a new generation of critical Canadian lawyers, I was already aware at that time of Didi's work, most notably a famous, I would argue, article she'd written as a law student concerning the use of pornography in the classroom to illustrate a debate on legal obscenity. Over time, it became evident that, along with others from the New World, Didi's work breathed fresh and lasting life into an English academic world that at that time was divided between the traditionalism of analytical jurisprudence and the then nihilism of the UK critical legal studies movement. No less critical than the crits, Didi and her compatriots managed the much-needed feat of at one and the same time taking law and legal theory seriously, while simultaneously subjecting it to a rigorous and pragmatic critique. This blend of radicalism and pragmatism continues to be the hallmark of Didi's work, and is nowhere more evident than in her reflection of English law's encounter with what it takes to be Jews and Jewishness. In An Unhappy Coincidence, Didi argues that this encounter of English law and Jews is infused by a series of values that, taken together, construct an image of Jews, Judaism and Jewishness that stands in stark contrast to dominant but unarticulated notions of Englishness. She argues further it is through this legal essence in construction of the Jews as the other of Englishness, that Englishness constructs its own uniqueness and its own belief in its superior standing. As paradoxical as it may sound, and as a consequence of the book's critical thrust, an unfortunate coincidence is less about Judaism and Jews in themselves as it is about notions of Englishness, and how this notion gains its meaning and effect within the domain of English law. A meaning and effect that has negative consequences for the claims and lives of not only actually existing Jews, but also for other minority groups when they become the subject of legal judgments. At the core of Didi's argument is that this relationship of English superiority and Jewish inferiority is informed by three distinct but intimately related strands of thinking: Orientalism, racialization, and Christianity. Orientalism points to an already loaded concept of civilization in which this dialectic of superiority and inferiority is inscribed. Racialization adds to these inscriptions of difference by locating them as a product of blood, or rather of Jewish blood. English blood, like other markers of Englishness, and as the benchmark of judgment, remaining to all intents and purposes invisible within the law and assumed. Underpinning these notions of Orientalism and racialism at play in the law is a more fundamental and, for Didi, more foundational premise which infuses them with meaning and is the key operative of English law's representation of Jews. This premise is Christianity in general and English Protestantism in particular. She argues that it is only through recognition of this factor and its connection with narratives of Orientalism and racialization that one can make sense of the particular contour of English law's negative representation of Jews, Judaism, and Jewishness. These points in turn lead to what amounts to the book's most radical claim, that the imposition of Christian norms can result in the court sanctioning de facto conversions, which amount to a form of symbolic ethnic cleansing, thereby continuing into the modern age an integral aspect of Christianity that has been in existence since at least the 13th century. The radicalism of this claim itself rests upon a deeper critique of the post-Enlightenment liberal notion of the domain of law as both secular and universal. Didi argues that law's presentation and understanding of itself as overcoming its prior attachment to a previously dominant Christianity in the name of secularism and hence universalism is deeply mistaken. Rather than law's domain existing as an arena of a theologically neutral or neutralized space in which all religious particularism and differences are erased, its secularism and universalism is and remains comprised of a set of principles or constellations of elements that are deeply Christian. To appreciate the nature of this claim, the point I believe Didi is making is not so much that the officially accepted story of law's trajectory from religious to secular and from particular to universal is merely incomplete, as if, with a little more critique, we can ensure law achieves its own self-image, but rather that the very notions of universalism and secularism upon which law grounds itself cannot but be expressions of an enduring Christianity. As Didi makes clear, it is this enduring Christian underpinning of the law that offers a line of continuity against which the diverse articulations of its presentation of Jews and Judaism, its framing in the language of character or of nation or of race and or a combination of all three, can be understood. These central themes of an unhappy coincidence emerge clearly in Didi's discussions of the nature and content of law's representation of Jews. Didi illustrates how, with its Christian underpinning, these judicial constructions develop at the interstices of race, nation, and character. In other words, how constructions of Jews and Judaism and Jewishness are always underpinned by a construction of Englishness that only gains meaning through an Orientalist and racialized othering of the Jew and Judaism. There is much, very much, to admire in this book, much to agree with, and as the mark of an original and groundbreaking work, and significant work, I hasten to add, much that is provocative. In terms of admiration, of course, is the production of the book itself. As Didi shows in the introduction, this work is to all intents and purposes the first extended treatment of English law's engagement, if that's the right word, with matters Jewish. And in bringing these matters to light, Didi shatters many of the myths that sustain English law. This quiet shattering of myths is elucidated clearly in each of the chapters, dealing as they do with different facets of the law. What I like especially is the way in which she shows how the law's contemporary treatment of Jews and Judaism reproduces its own negative judgments while simultaneously forgetting and erasing its own law's own problematic past. This point comes out most clearly in Didi's discussion of the history and trajectory of the race relations legislation, beginning in the mid-1960s and continuing to the present day. In these sections of the book, she highlights how the rhetorical power of what she rightly terms the abstracted figure of the Jew was utilised through adoption of, and again the term is Didi's, stock footage of the Holocaust by both supporters and opponents of the various acts. As she rightly notes, the Nazi persecuted Jew appears in these discussions as what I would call an empty counter, through which any meaningful account of the substance of the Holocaust reality and its impact on actually existing Jews is made invisible. In so doing, England's actual historical response to the Holocaust is occluded, as is the court's refusal to acknowledge the impact of the Holocaust in the series of cases both at the time of its occurrence and in the decades that followed. Through the construction and use of the Jew as paradigmatic or empty symbolic victim, Didi illustrates the ways in which the court exclude claims made by almost all minority groups suffering discrimination and oppression. Indeed, she observes the paradox that such groups include English Jews themselves, who have never, in the history of race relations legislation, succeeded in claims against non-Jews. These failed claims articulate themselves through the twin ideas that first, as regards non-Jewish groups, since the harms suffered in England can never match those suffered by Jews in the Holocaust, applications of the Race Relations Acts are neutralised. Secondly, and in relation specifically to Jews, that anti-Semitism is now safely consigned to the past and of little relevance today in today's post-Holocaust world. Indeed, I'd go further and argue that the negative effects of this use of the Jew as paradigmatic victim goes even further. The abstracted figure of the Jew comes to act as the moral economy's medium of exchange, a sort of reinvention of the alleged Jewishness of money, the effect of which is to create further anti-Jewish hostility from within the praxis of the race relations legislation itself. This potentiality arises through the idea that the uniqueness of the Shoah comes to be reread as conferring some sort of privilege on Jews, against which other groups are measured and found wanting. Although Didi does not raise this point directly, her work indicates that the root of this anti-Jewish myth lies in the narratives of English race relations law, and brings with it its own amnesia and rewriting of the past under the fog of its own mythology. This observation in turn leads to a further point of agreement and admiration. In tracing the law's orientalizing and racializing of Jews and Judaism, Didi simultaneously brings into light the hitherto invisibility of the English Christian measure of judgment that she sees underpinning these processes. That is, the silent assumptions or common sense that appears not to be in need of articulation. Here I was struck by the ways in which the courts play off not only Jews against law's own silent presupposition, but also against other discriminated minorities. Nowhere is this more in evidence than at key moments in the book's arguments. Didi cites recent judgments in which the judge's evaluation of Judaism is positively compared to that of Islam. Read in this way, it appears as if, contrary to all the evidence Didi produces, and contrary to law's own treatment of Judaism, it is Judaism and not Christianity that is presented by the judges as the substance of law's measure. Thus, at the end of a discussion of trusts, in which she illustrates how until at least the 1970s, the judges had presented Judaism as inherently obscure and unknowable, Didi writes of a 2007 case that, and I'm quoting Didi, in Halpern against Halpern, a meaning about a will where the judge expressly drew a distinction between the plain meaning of the phrase Jewish law as opposed to Islamic law, the judge noted, the principles of the glorious Sharia law would seem to be a very uncertain phrase. Following these words, Didi sighs, and the sigh is actually audible in the text. Perhaps little has been learnt after all. I wonder, however, whether the implicit chronology of the law's treatment of Judaism and Islam, respectively, cannot be rather seen in more contemporaneous terms. This question is given force by a discussion of the case in which both Jews and Arabs were treated as not only inherently not English, but also as standing in natural and by definition eternal and existential opposition and conflict to each other. The point here, of course, is that in both these cases, the courts are at one and the same time engaging in the othering of both Jews and Arabs and positing a confrontation between both groups, whilst at the same time the specifically English Christian measure of judgment that informs this narrative and which creates this apparent conflict remains deeply hidden from view. As will hardly come as a surprise to Didi, and we've spoken of this in the past, there are some aspects of the book's thesis, the acceptance of which I am slightly more cautious. Didi says that the Christianity that underpins her thesis represents a continuity in English law from its earlier Christian origins. This may be, but I think also one could see the changing forms through which this negative representation of Jews is articulated as speaking to their changing content and premise. To be clear about the point I am making, I am not arguing that English Christianity plays no role in the shifting basis of law's representations of matters Jewish, but rather that role needs to be understood in relation to other temporal and specifically English political and social influences. My caution on these points arises through Didi's recognition of a substantive shift taking place within the law's narrative of Jews and Judaism beginning in the 1960s and reaching its full fruition in the late 1980s and early 1990s. At the heart of this shift is a developing acknowledgement of the mass killings of Jewish Europeans, that is, of the Shoah. However, whilst I agree that there is something specifically English about the articulation of this acknowledgement, I wonder whether its effects can be located in different, but again equally English context than that of the Christianity of an earlier period. Related to this point, I wonder also whether one can detect a further shift that appears, roughly speaking, and for numerous reasons, at the turn of the 21st century. It is in this last period that I believe we can identify a return to more Christian modes of thinking within the law, through which notions of both Jews and Muslims, Judaism and Islam, Jewishness and Muslimness are articulated and exemplified in the JFS case of 2010. In the chapter discussing the race relations legislation, Didi highlights the knots both politicians and judges tied themselves in through their attempts to define the Jews. Were Jews a religion, a nation, a race, or an ethnicity? Such questions were, of course, nothing new and continue to this very day. Yet, despite this continuity, the manner in which they addressed and partially and unsatisfactorily answered these questions, or is that a question, was a consequence of numerous specifically English factors, not necessarily involving a predominant concern with Christianity. First, and as Didi explains, was the fact that the main focus of this body of legislation had little, if anything, to do with Jews, but was rather concerned with confronting the discrimination faced by those with a different skin colour and assumed point of origin. And as Didi notes, such legislation is not to be understood without its connection with those acts limiting immigration from Asia and Africa. As Didi notes, there was and has been little disagreement since that time of the almost universal acceptance of the concept of race and racism as applied to these situations. Yet it is precisely these concepts of race and racism that caused, I believe, the English judiciary such difficulty when applied to Jews. As I notice above, and as Didi draws out so well, inherent in the judiciary's construction of Jews and Judaism is a corresponding mythology of England and English law. Again, as she shows, one such myth was the self-image of England as a constant and implacable foe of Hitler and Nazi Germany, and as a welcoming point of refuge for Jews in particular. Any recollection or even thoughts of compromise, or worse, of collaboration with the Third Reich, as well as the history of the UK's refusal to accept its Jewish refugees, is written out of the story. It is this myth that Didi traces in her discussion of the parliamentary debates preceding the passing of the first Race Relations Act in 1965. Yet I would argue that it is precisely this exercise in distinguishing England and English law from Nazism that can in large measure account for the political and judicial difficulties in defining Jews in terms of race. To put the matter differently, if English law had at the time recognised Jews as a distinct race with the implications of specific racial attributes, then the mythical dividing line separating England and English law from any connection or similarity with Nazism and Nazi law would, if not collapse, at least become blurred. It would have stirred memories of the fact that prior to, during, and as well as after the rise of Nazism, English judicial pronouncement on Jews, Judaism, and Jewishness were expressed in very similar racial terms. In the light of these thoughts, it could be that it was the very concept of race and the need to distinguish itself from Nazism and Nazi law, assuming it is law, that account for the equivocations that cause the difficulties of definition under the Acts. After all, as the debates and judgments show, how could English law argue for clear blue water between itself and Nazism and racist representations of the Jew without appearing to fall into similar ways of thinking? Thus, while the difficulty of representing the Jews of this period exhibits a specifically English character, it could be that it has less to do with its underpinning of Christianity, but more to do with maintaining a rhetorical distance from its own problematic history, as well as continuing the myth of England's innocence. The place of Nazism in the Shoah, and I think this section actually goes to your concern that the people you're discussing disappear from view. They don't. The place of Nazism and the Shoah within the consciousness of English law also manifests itself in a problematic manner in the case of Re P in 1990. 1990, I would say, is a period in which awareness of the Shoah was beginning to reach its height within popular and academic discourse. In Re P, the Orthodox Jewish claimants perceived unattractiveness, and these are quotes from Didi's book, and his irrational, emotional, or it's not Didi's description of the person, of his irrational, emotional, erratic, and seemingly vengeful behaviour was accounted for by the judge of the consequence, and there was no relevance to the case at hand, of experiences of internment in a concentration camp in which members of his family were killed. In other words, even though, as Didi shows, such images of the Jew are a constant staple of English law, its alleged reality was now premised not so much on Christian assumptions, racial or otherwise, but as on the consequence of an assumed, no evidence was given, of a psychological trauma said to be brought about by his earlier experiences. Jews and Jewishness, in other words, moves within the law from an alleged religious racial category to what amounts to markers of a psychological pathology. If in this period, the 1980s to the late 1990s, it is English law's attempt to mask its own past relationship to Nazism, along with its overt acknowledgement of the Shoah, that forms the predominant underpinning for its negative representation of Jews, Judaism, Jewishness, matters shift again in the first years of the 21st century, as is evident in the discussion and analysis of the JFS case. I think Didi is almost certainly correct that this case offers a clear illustration of her general thesis. In this case, Jews are both racialized through the application of mistaken notions of bloodlines, while at the same time Christian Protestant notions of worship are taken as proof of religious affiliation, both elements of which stand in stark contrast to the tenets of actually existing Jewish law. However, despite this agreement, and as my comments have indicated, I am less convinced of the decision's continuity with previous cases, most notably those of the previous 2 or 3 decades. A possible alternative explanation is that although this re-racializing of Jews exhibits similar characteristics to earlier forms of thought, it is less a case of continuity, but more a case of a return to or revival of an overtly Christian worldview that has recently gained or regained in ascendancy. I think it is more or less unquestionable that the language of race, of nationality, and of Christianity have become more central in social and political debate since the events of 9/11 and the nonsense of the clash of civilizations that followed in its wake. On this account, one need only think of what is termed the renationalization of Europe, as well as the attempt by some European states to define the European Union in specifically Christian terms. Likewise, in the field of academia, one can note the number of works centering on the politics of St. Paul, as well as the emergence of radical orthodoxy pioneered by the Christian theologian John Milbank, and so on. Indeed, it may well be that it is this present climate that accounts not only for the fact of the timely appearance of an unfortunate coincidence, but which also accounts for its critical importance, an importance that reaches, or at least should reach, well beyond the sometimes narrow confines of the law school. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I just wanted to thank David and Didi for inviting me. I think it's quite clear from what David has already said that Didi's ambition in terms of the significance of this book is quite clearly going to be met. I wanted to just start off where David left off, with the significance of this book in the context of the 9/11 world in which we live, because it strikes me that something quite interesting went on just after 9/11 and that has been going on for some time, in that the discourse that Didi is talking about, racialization, Orientalism, starts to take a particular form during this period. We suddenly see the coupling of not just a Christian civilization, but a Judeo-Christian civilization being presented as the way in which the West is going to defend itself from its non-Western enemies, its non-Western others. And I just wanted to start off by saying that political context, as David said, is really important to understand as the context in which Didi's book is appearing, because I think what Didi's book does quite clearly is to decouple that particular political project of presenting the Judeo-Christian civilization as being the West, necessarily. And I think the importance of that really is the assumption that somehow Western Judeo-Christian culture is what is being defended in this new link that's actually going on in the new confrontation between the West and the non-West. And I think what's important about the methods that Didi's actually given us, and both Didi and David have set those out, is that I think not only in the areas in which Didi is writing, but I think more generally in the areas of thinking about processes of racialization and orientalizing, I think that the methods that she's presenting to us, both as legal scholars, but also I think in a wider range of discipline, are really important to try and get into more detail into what that process is, and to try and challenge some of these political assumptions that I think have gained ground. And what I really want to do is to pick up on all three of the processes, but particularly Didi's contribution in terms of the methods that she presents and the way in which racialization and orientalizing processes in relation to Jews take place within English law. And I think it's clear both from, in particular, the earlier chapters on cases in trusts, but also the cases on child welfare cases, that her main argument is demonstrated through her analysis of this case, which is that if not conversion in the strong sense, and I think she's quite hesitant early on in the book about using the term conversion, certainly strong processes of assimilation are actually taking place in these sort of cases. And I think that the word conversion actually is appropriate in this sort of context, where we're actually talking about trying to unravel the Christian foundations of English law. Because as Stephen Kruger has shown, a conversion identity, that is an identity paradoxically dependent upon a radical change in identity, is historically constitutive of both the Christian community and the Christian individual. And I think that historical work in the period that precedes the cases that Didi's examined also, I think, teaches something quite important about the way in which this identity for Latin Christendom, for Europe in itself, is an unstable identity from the point of view of Christians themselves. And this conversion identity, if you like, needs another to verify it. And so that the myth that we have in contemporary liberal constitutionalism, which is absolute foundation, really, for the way in which law thinks about itself and the individual, and Western law thinks about itself, which is the idea that the Western individual subject is self-identifying and is autonomous, I think is a really important, in a really important way, shown to be a myth and a fantasy through the cases and through the analysis that Didi's actually taken us through, with a very specific focus on the law's treatment of Jews and Jewishness. And I think the trust cases in particular show quite clearly that the reference to Jewishness in these particular cases as being uncertain, as being unstable, is actually just a decoy of an attempt to try and define the other, i.e. Christianity, in a more stable way, as a universal and as a stable category against which Jewishness can actually be understood. And I think that also what this analysis actually shows is the danger of masking the true relationship of what is actually going on in these cases, because the fear is not really necessarily about an unstable other. The fear is also about the fact that one's own self is not autonomous in these sort of cases and is unstable and needs to be solidified through these sort of contrasts. And I think that's why I think that final quote that Didi ends the book with, that chapter from Brenda Hale at the end of the book, which I kind of read out for you, is so important, because Brenda Hale, in the final kind of chapter, as the final chapter kind of focuses on the JFS case, Brenda Hale, Lady Hale, in that case, the JFS case, in the House of Lords, says the Christian Church will admit children regardless of who their parents are. And the absolutely core need for a comparison at that point for the judges in the JFS case to actually be able to make a comparison with Jews in order to be able to solidify what in fact is the norm, what is the universal norm of Christianity, isn't a coincidence at all. It's absolutely necessary, I think, to the project of the way in which the law has to try and construct and try and understand not only Jewishness, but also try and understand and stabilise its own foundations, I think, in really very important respects. So I think that the really important point is that this is significant for law. Didi's work is significant for law. But I think that for non-lawyers, it's also a point of entry into a much wider debate, not only about how English law treats Jewish difference, but also how English identity as a Christian, Anglican mainly, identity, is a myth that is created through the force of operation of power rather than a natural fact. And by uncovering the way in which this myth is created through the use of legal power and within judicial discourse, I think it invites us to ask wider questions. Famously, it's actually Quinton Skinner, the historian who was at Cambridge, who's now at QMW, who rarely comments on the role of history in public discourse, famously said in an essay and a lecture he did at the British Academy that one of the key roles that history has to play in our present public understandings is that it can reveal to us that certain stories we tell ourselves about who we are obscure the role that power has played and the way in which important groups have been able to actually manufacture our idea of England as being an absolutely safeguard of Anglican identity. His argument in that lecture is that actually that myth about England being an Anglican island is a myth that leaves out very important groups and individuals, and it's the imposition of power that's actually created that particular myth. And I think that Didi's work, by focusing on law, actually leads us into what is an absolutely central question about national identity and about Englishness. And it's about the extent to which not only law, but also political discourse requires comparisons with another in order to stabilise ideas of the nation, ideas of who is or is not English, in terms of, as Didi said, not only norms, but also behaviour. And I think that what Didi's work shows is the way in which Jewish difference plays a pivotal role in the making of English Christian identity, not only through the law, but it invites us to actually ask this question, I think, in a wider range of disciplines and also in a wider range of political discussions. And I realise that reflecting on this particular issue at this particular moment isn't necessarily a very optimistic project. Looking back on the history, obviously, of the last century, trying to reflect on whether or not we can break these processes of racialization and Orientalism that have necessarily required Jewish difference as a way of stabilizing the identity, not only of English identity, but the identity of Christian Europe, is quite clearly going to require taking seriously not only what has gone on for centuries, but particularly given what's happened in terms of the experience of the Holocaust in the last century. But I think whilst I'm not optimistic about the ability to kind of break through these sort of processes, I think that what is absolutely essential is for us to identify that this is the reality of the way in which processes of racialization, Orientalism do take place in relation to not only Jews but other non-Christian minorities, religious and racial minorities, as Didi and I think would both argue. But I think that it invites us to ask a question looking forward towards the rest of the 21st century about whether or not we can imagine processes operating in a different way, how we can interrupt these processes of racialization and Orientalism, of Jewish difference, but also other types of religious and racial difference. And I think the reason it's particularly important to ask these questions at this time is because they're required to challenge, I think, an assumption, particularly in Western Europe, particularly amongst liberal constitutionalism, about the ascendancy and the victory of liberalism, of a certain type of universal subject of liberalism that is the absolute safeguard of freedom and equality. And I think, as Didi's work shows, I think absolutely critical to the conclusions that she comes to is that rather than being a haven for freedom and equality and the idea of a universal autonomous subject, these concepts are often a decoy for a much deeper, much more complicated process through which individuals are being forced to assimilate and or are being coerced into norms and forms of behavior that actually are reflective of not universal norms, but a very particular type of Christian historical tradition. And I think the reason it's also important to ask these questions now is the reasons that I think Didi both refers to in her book and also that she's referred to today, which is that her arguments apply not only to Jewish minorities, but they also apply much to a much wider range of minorities, Western Europe, which is non-Christian religious minorities, but also racial minorities, because the arguments that she's putting for us in terms of processes of racialization, Orientalism, also, I think, importantly apply to the binary that's created between the West and the non-West, or the East, as Didi calls it. And I think that's one of the most important contributions of this book, is to actually break down certain intellectual divisions that have grown up within scholarship, but also politically, between anti-Semitism on the one hand, racism on the other, and battles against colonialism. Because I think importantly what Didi shows is that there are commonalities between each of these processes. I think that's important for us to understand intellectually, but I think it's also important for us to understand politically. Because I think, as David said, there are attempts, as some of the English law cases show, of trying to draw wedges between these different groups. And Guylain Deja has talked about the way in which divisions between Jews and Arabs are created and manufactured in order to, in fact, maintain the hegemony and the ascendancy of this, he would say, Christian model of secularism, Christian model of universalism, on the other hand. And I think that once we start seeing these commonalities, once we start seeing that there is something in common in terms of these processes, not just in relation to Jews, but other types of groups, I think that perhaps a glimmer of hope may appear in terms of how these processes can be interrupted, or at the very least, contained. Because whilst we may be pessimistic about the ability of Western Europe, Latin Christendom, to be able to have the insight and the critical capacity to be able to reflect on its own processes and to be able to interrupt them, I think, as David said, the world that we face now and the world that Latin Christendom faces at the start of the 21st century is quite different from the one that it's faced in the last 200 years. Because I think that the shift in economic and political power away from Europe towards non-Western areas and countries, India and China, is going to force a reflection on the part of Western Europeans, on the part of Christians, about how they're going to interact with non-Christians, and whether or not they are going to want to force a particular model of universalism to which they're committed, and try and convert large swathes of the population to this particular project. Whilst 200 years ago, I suppose we can say that the start of the process is Napoleon's conquest of Egypt, late 18th century. Whilst at the end of the 18th century, Europe was in a position to be able to send gunboats and to be able to use huge amounts of coercive violence to be able to force that conversion. I think that it's unlikely that that is something that's going to be able to continue. So whilst I think we may be pessimistic about minorities within Western Europe being able to force this change, I think the geopolitical situation that we now confront means that there is a glimmer of opportunity to get a debate and a certain amount of critical reflection within European nation states and European liberal democracies about how they're going to interact with non-Western others. And I think the domestic situation is very depressing. As David said, looking across at Western Europe at the moment, the rise of nationalism suggests that at the moment there is a return to forms of thinking and attempts to try and impose certain models of universalism and nationalism on non-Christian minorities. So I just wanted to end by saying that I hope I've been able to say that the significance of Didi's book goes well beyond the law, although it's very significant towards for legal scholars. And as David said, the book is groundbreaking and the book is unique. It's the first study of its kind. And it's quite surprising that, as she says herself, that, this is the first time that this issue has been taken seriously by lawyers. And I think my sense is, in answer to her question, I think it did take someone who was outside the system altogether to be able to read those sort of issues, because I think those of us who brought up within the English system are too embedded in this particular identity to be able to notice these complex ways in which English identity is linked to Christianity. So, and just to end, I think the significance goes beyond law. I think that it's a perfect book to be published at this time to raise these very significant issues, not only about Jews and Jewishness, but I think about a whole range of other issues about how the West is actually going to confront its loss of power in relation to the non-West. Thank you.
Thank you very much, all three of you. we have some time now, and I'd like to open up our discussion to questions, also comments, which you might have. And I think that what I'd like to do is to take a few at a time, and then ask our three speakers to respond rather than just a ping pong back and forth. Yeah.
I'm intrigued by the term Orientalism. It just doesn't quite. I mean, in the arguments.
Could you just speak up a little
I'm
bit?
intrigued by the term Orientalism.
Orientalism, that's what he asked.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that's fine. I mean, I'm sure we'll deal with that. I mean, if no one has got anything to say immediately or to comment immediately, then I'm sure we can find an answer. Yes.
I had a wonderful presentation by these learned scholars, and throughout there's something I can't help remembering. Some years ago, when there was the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, I think the report was first, I'm not sure. And one of his comments was, of course, the well-known one that the police are institutionally racist. And at that time and since, whether they are or not, I can't help thinking that it was only ever reflecting what society as a whole was. And I think similarly with a judiciary, whatever the actual strictures, at the end of the day, I think they can only ever in some way either reflect or be slightly in advance of what society as a whole, non-legal, happens to have as its tenor.
Thank you. Well, shall we start with those two? No, do you want to start?
I mean, on the Orientalism point, Didi may have something more to say about it, but I think that actually it's a really important contribution to an analysis of anti-Semitism that Didi has included within the debate about Jews and Jewishness, and therefore it opens up the issues about how this relates to anti-Semitism, the fact of a connection, and the way in which Jews themselves are orientalized. They're placed outside the definition of what is Western, what is European. And by doing that, I think it's really important, because I think that what it does is to force us to recognize what she's focused on in the book, which is the theological element, which is the religious element that takes place in processes of racialization. And also, I think, the way in which European identity, despite being represented now as being secular, and forms of secularism that we have in Europe, are importantly related to Christianity. Not just Christianity generally, but a very particular form of Christianity within Western Europe. So I think that this is actually one of the unique contributions of the book. And I think what it'll really help with is to allow scholars of colonialism and Orientalism to come back and relate their subjects back to the issue of the treatment of Jews in Europe. And that's really important, because most people who kind of use Orientalism in Edward Said's work and talk about colonialism tend to start in about the 17th century. And they don't tend to make connections between the way in which Jews were represented, for example, in Spain, in the Middle Ages, but also elsewhere, and the way in which those attitudes influenced
society. And what I liked about Didi's book is that Law will say we're above the fray. We take everyone formally equal, and what Didi shows is how those influences from society actually are included in that allegedly neutral universal sphere. I mean, that whole relationship is very complex, and I haven't worked it through yet, but I think that's the strength of Didi's book, showing that it's not quite what Law tells itself that it is.
I'll just say a couple of things. I think I don't have much to add to what Malay has said about Orientalism, other than maybe to respond to what David said, which is I think there was a part of me that actually was seeking to provoke that discomfort. Not consciously, but because Orientalism really has not been a term applied to an understanding of Jewishness in England. And it felt to me quite a useful concept to use in my analysis, but I was aware that it was provocative and could cause discomfort, I guess, but I thought that was something that might be productive, I think. I don't know. On the relationship between the judiciary and wider society, I mean, I've actually had a lot of, well, maybe not a lot, but some feedback from people quite discomforted with my analysis, who say, for example, that judges are actually very constrained by precedent, by doctrine, and so on. So I think and they don't simply follow general trends. So I think I was actually trying partly to argue, not against that, because the judges are constrained by precedent and doctrine, but not necessarily completely, and not necessarily in the ways that some people might argue. So I was trying to in a sense argue against that as well.
This question. Yeah.
I'm not quite sure what, I came in a bit late, what you mean by Christendom, because I think when you look at the EU, if you look at the, first of all, it's not Christian at all. Ode to Joy or something is absolutely free for all. And if you look at Bruegel's, if you like, in Strasbourg, the shape of the building is based on the Tower of Babel, which is, if you know that story, they wanted to be greater than God. I think that it's a godless organisation, an anti-Christian, and I think Europe is going to be the place, I'm a Bible believer, where it'll rise to its ascendancy, but not in any shape or form with any, good English basic Christian tenets, but with the Antichrist.
Yeah, I was just going to say that Karl Marx seems to believe that all these matters are economically determined. Do you agree with that, or do you really believe that, because hardly anybody goes to church anymore, so whether Christianity really,
Here and then. Yeah.
One quick point. I think it's important, I'm not denying that Britain doesn't have an underpinning of Anglicanism, but I think it's important that we pick up that's a subsection of Christianity. Christianity isn't homogenous, because if you look at some non-Western Christianity, it seems quite othered, particularly African Pentecostalism, which is kind of seen as too religious, too enthusiastic. Seems to be an understated Christianity of England that we. I'd really like to ask a question about the Jewish free school issue. I thought this was something to do with reform versus orthodoxy, and to do with different ways of being a Jew, and therefore by saying that a Judaism that is non-matrilineal is somehow Christian or anti-Jewish seems a bit sectarian.
I wanted to ask about the relationship with Orientalism and Antisemitism, because if you read Said's the book Orientalism, you find actually that Antisemitism is fundamental to Orientalism and mediated by linguistics, because he says that the main Orientalists were philologists, what we call linguists today. And he gives an example, a lengthy example of Ernest Renan, the professor of Hebrew, a non-believing Christian professor of Hebrew, who did this analysis of the Semitic languages, arguing that they were dead, had been, as it were, superseded, and contrasting those with the Indo-European languages, which were the living, progressive. So it's the Christian discourse about progressivism versus, obsolete Judaism. So that these tropes, these sort of ancient anti-Semitic tropes within Christianity, reinstantiated within Orientalism, and Said sets this out very carefully, except he doesn't acknowledge it explicitly. If you look at the index for references to anti-Semitism in the book Orientalism, there aren't any, or there are one or two very brief ones. And it's always struck me that actually anti-Semitism is fundamental to the discourse of Orientalism, but it's something which the Orientalism as an academic project has not fully acknowledged. And even though you're using it in a different way, apparently, in your book, I haven't read, I think that this complicates the issue that Malaya has raised about the relationship between these two things.
I mean, I'll just say extremely briefly, I think that's absolutely right, although the book, which actually does approach that in an interesting way, is Martin Burnell's Black Athena, which actually does insert anti-Semitism into that same story. But I shouldn't have said that. Malaya, do you want to?
Shall I start again? Right.
Yeah, please.
Well, if I could just focus on that issue, I think there are really important relationships between the two. I mean, I need to do a bit more thinking about it, but I think there'll be really important differences as well, because I think that thinking about the way in which Latin Christendom's approached Jewish minorities who are internal to Europe, as compared with how they've approached, for example, Arab or Muslim populations that they come into contact with. They're really important, and this goes back to your question about Marx, really important political and material differences of those relationships that I think are relevant to understanding it. But I would agree with you wholeheartedly that I think that there are really important tropes that get carried on by Europeans when they come into contact with other people, non-Western people. A person who's traced this through is Norman Daniels, who talks about Islam, talks about the way in which Muslims are actually constructed in the European imagination through the prism of the relationship with Jews. I also think there's important differences because Judaism and Islam are different. So Christians react to Judaism and Islam in very different ways, so that their response to Islam is as a heresy per se, whereas the response to Judaism is a bit more complicated in the sense that so much of the Jewish scripture is something that Christians themselves want to be able to endorse. So all those, I think, make for differences, but I think the structural similarities of the racialization process, I think are very similar for both. I mean, I think the political context in the present for why one might want to bring these together is that I think in some instances, I think David Theo Goldberg has actually traced this and sorted this out really well. I think there is a sense in which attributions of anti-Semitism to Arab and Muslim populations, some of which might be true, very many of them are an exaggeration, are actually turning into an alibi for racism against Arabs in certain types, in certain countries. So, for example, I was in Germany recently talking about the debates they were having about integration in their Muslim Turkish population, and I was told by someone in the Ministry of Interior in Germany that the real problem with the Turkish populations in Germany is that they had introduced the alien concept of hatred of Jews and anti-Semitism into Germany. And this was the reason the Germans were really concerned about the ability of these new foreigners to be able to integrate into German values. And a friend of mine mischievously said that surely the first sign of integration of Turks into Germany is that they would start articulating. But so I think that is a political, there's an intellectual reason and then there's a political issue at stake.
Just briefly, I'm not an expert on Orientalism. It's really Didi's work that's introduced me to it. But in terms of Didi's work, following the footnotes of the first two chapters really discusses these issues. I mean, those first few footnotes is another book waiting to be written, hopefully, on why is it that the discourses of anti-racism and of critical race theory have not addressed the question of anti-Semitism. It goes to your point about separating or appearing to separate racism, anti-Semitism, and as Malaya and Didi's work shows, it's about bringing it together whilst recognising that, as you quite rightly said, Jews and Muslims aren't identical. So really there's a subtext to Didi's book which you don't quite develop because it's not the point of the book. But I found reading those footnotes absolutely fascinating on that question. And actually I was going to talk about it, but I chose a different take. Marxism, or rather economic determinism, which is probably slightly different from Marxism. Yes, but Marx, as we know, after about sort of the 1850s, didn't really discuss notions of cultural reproduction, or could I call it cultural capital. So, as Malaya said in her comments about the shift since the last 10 years or so, there is an economic factor at play as well in all of this. I just don't think one can separate it out and call it something on its own that then influences the other. I think it's all there in the mix. Okay. So.
Just briefly, on the use of the term Christendom and the EU as the Antichrist, believe it or not, I've actually written about that in the past. I have a whole article about people who think the EU is the Antichrist. So if you're interested, just email me and I'll send you a copy. On the Marx question, or what you said afterwards, actually, hardly anyone goes to church these days. That doesn't matter to me for the purposes of this book, how many people go to church. What matters to me is underlying Christian thinking. And in fact, the fewer people go to church, the easier it is to kind of obscure that underlying Christian thinking. So that's sort of why that's kind of a question that's somewhat at odds with what the book's trying to do, I guess. The point about Christianity not being homogenous, I completely agree, and I do talk about that in the book. However, some thinking is shared, and I think it's really important to identify that. And I also mentioned, probably in a footnote, that also standing apart from mainstream, if you will, Christian thinking, are forms of Christianity that are seen to be beyond the pale. People who, for example, believe in miracle cures, or, for example, that the EU is the Antichrist. So I do talk about that, and certain kinds of Christianity that are characterized as standing outside the world of reason. On the no offense, are characterized by judges as standing outside the world of reason. On the JFS case, wasn't this just an internal conflict? As I understood your question was, yes, in some ways it was an internal. It was an internal conflict about the strict or the way that the office of the chief rabbi was applying the matrilineal test. So that was the origins of the case, yes, but it became much more than that as it progressed through the courts, and that is my focus, is actually how is what then happened to it after that point. I don't think I have anything on the question of racialization or Orientalism to add to what they've said.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you to all the speakers, particularly my old friend Malaya Herman. I have to say that, I haven't read your book, but I look forward to reviewing it shortly, and probably will be less than reverential.
I'm sure this is the third time you've come to a panel I've been on.
Third of many.
Great.
I think that constitutes stalking.
Yeah, that's what I think too.
Intellectual stalking.
So somebody could give me the legal definition of stalking. That would be a good start. I have to say I didn't agree with much of what's been said here, particularly about, as a secularist, obviously, I completely disagree with Malaya's comments on secularism. I do believe in universal law, and I certainly don't think that the state should actually be judging people on the basis of their religion. So we have a little bit of common ground. we can spend all evening discussing the Christian or the non-Christian origins of secularism. Clearly, the Protestantism has and the disputes with Catholicism played a great part in paving the way to secularism. Nobody's denying that. Now, on the JFS case, I find it quite troubling that this is included in discussions of anti-Semitism because, first of all, there was an internal conflict. The presiding judge was Jewish. 3 of the other judges were Jewish. Both sets of lawyers were Jewish. Money was raised within the Jewish community for this legal case. Essentially, what happened was that the court was asked to decide about the process of conversion, something which the state should keep out of. The state shouldn't have any view about who is or who is not Jewish. That's an internal matter for the Jewish community. So, although the result of the case was perhaps the right one, the legal reasoning behind it was not. And of course, the legal reasoning stems back not to statute, but to case law, Mandela and Dowell Lee, which actually racialized people, which actually racialized the Jewish community, because for the first time, both Sikhs and Jews were given special exemptions. So it was the Racial Relations Act. And of course, when you somehow implied that the Racial Relations Act itself was somehow imbued with anti-Semitism, that's nonsense, because it was written by a Jewish lawyer, Anthony Lester QC, and I think another Jewish lawyer. So the arguments put forward so far seem rather unfounded. The JFS case has actually left the law in a very unclear way. It's muddied the waters without satisfying anybody. Now, in a further detail, the fact is that the people who took the case don't have a legal remedy because the boy has been admitted to the school. So it's left the law in an unsatisfactory way. Now, I have to say that another thing you mentioned was that most Jews have taken cases against non-Jews have lost. Well, actually, most cases based on identity have been lost. Most cases brought under the Racial Relations Act do not succeed because of the high evidential test and so on, and other details such as Attorney General's agreements and so on and so forth. So the arguments made so far are unfounded. They are not convincing.
I'm glad the consensus has been broken through, but I think it would be good if we wind things up by asking all 3 of our speakers to respond to at least some elements.
Yeah. I mean, I have to confess, whether or not I think that the issue of whether or not the drafters of the Race Relations Act or the judges in question are Jewish or not is irrelevant to the argument that Didi's making, because actually her argument is about the structural processes, and it's quite likely that Jewish people involved in the legal system will also reflect these in terms of applying English law, because what she's, I think, demonstrated without a shadow of doubt is the way in which these are recurring tropes within the law, that actually very difficult processes to break. And that's what's a bit depressing about the book in some ways, is that it is structural and it's there within the legal system. I mean, I think as far as the Race Relations Act is concerned, just to add to a comment, I didn't mention that. I think that judges find it very difficult to place Jews and Judaism within the Race Relations Act, because I think, as David was saying, the historical context within which the Act emerges is actually about trying to deal with processes of Commonwealth post-war migration. It's about economic deprivation. It's about gaps between migrants coming and finding it difficult to actually fit into England. And judges find it really difficult to fit the Jewish minority, which it perceives, as I think, Didi's comments make clear, it perceives as being the perfect minority in many ways, right? Because and which is being held up now by, I believe, nowadays the discourse is, why can't all minorities be more like the Jewish community? But actually, I think what's really valuable about what Didi's shown is the cost that's paid and the damage that's caused by that kind of fantasy for Jews themselves, who kind of have this this fantasy portrayed back to them that actually, well, there's no way that Jews can be victims of discrimination because look, they've done so well. They're the paradigm of how a minority should actually be. But I think what Didi's also shown in the book is the way in which that really is fantasy, and that at various points when the reality of what it means to be Jewish or the reality of someone who's actually bringing claims within English law, rather than dealing with the facts and the reality of the litigant before them, judges fall back on these fantasies and this kind of basically tropes about who is Jewish, what it means to be Jewish, etc. So I think that there is a real problem with the Race Relations Act and its treatment of Jews, and the fact that the drafters were Jewish and the fact that many of the judges in JFS are Jewish is neither here nor there.
Yeah, forgive me when I say this, but maybe read the book first. And I'm not being rude, because I think you might have misunderstood some of the points that Didi made about anti-Semitism in relation to, and Didi, as far as I'm aware in the book, does not say...
Talk about anti-Semitism.
Yeah, and moreover does not talk about the Race Relations Act being anti-Semitic. But one thing that Malaya raised about the Jews as the perfect minority, again, that's that amnesia that, to be honest, the Jewish community also falls into. That somehow, 1890s East End London was absolutely a wonderful place, and it was absolutely fantastic, and there was no Jewish crime, and there was no Jewish prostitution, there was no Jewish anarchism, no Jewish communism, and the British police absolutely adored Jews and couldn't to welcome them. But you do mention the 1905 Aliens Act, which is very interesting in that. So my comment really is on the more specific things. Engage with what Didi's written, and then the questions that you've asked might have been answered themselves. Didi, I don't know if you want to.
Well, I was gonna end my comments by saying that as well. I never ever said or would say that the Race Relations Act was imbued with anti-Semitism. I mean, that just doesn't make sense. I agree with you. It's, of course, most race relations cases are lost and have been lost. I say that in the book. So if you could just read that next time, I'm sure you'll come back for a fourth confrontation. Please do read the book first, because most of what you said doesn't make any sense. Also, Mandla is not a case that created special exemptions. There's lots of problems with Mandla, but it wasn't about special exemptions. So anyway, I don't really have anything more to say.
Well, I think on that note of not having anything more to say, I'll bring things to an end. But I'll just say a couple of things before I do. One thing is to apologise if any of you did have a problem in finding the change of venue. We did try to inform everyone, and we wouldn't all fitted comfortably into the other room. Of course, the people to whom I ought really be apologising are the people who are still wandering out there trying to find the place. But I am sorry if you had a problem. There is wine and crisps and nuts and various bits for you outside, so please do help yourselves. We also have a number of copies of, I think 10 copies of Didi's book. However, no one from OUP, perhaps he got lost as well, has turned up to take your money for them. However, if you want, if any of you people don't have checkbooks anymore, but if you have either a checkbook or exactly £27.50, which would be a 20% discount, so it's almost wholesale, then I'll be happy to take your money off of you on behalf of Didi and OUP, and you have my word that it will reach the proper place in the course of time, after I've invested it, obviously. My grandfather, I recall, spent some time in jail for doing exactly that. So I have family for me there. But I would like to thank all of you for turning up. For those of you who have contributing, but especially to thank our speakers and especially Didi for writing such a wonderful book, and David and Malaya for helping to promote such a lucid and interesting discussion of it. Thank you all very much indeed.